The city breathed a cold, gray breath, thick with the scent of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. It was a living, indifferent entity, its towering buildings scraping a bruised sky, its alleys like veins choked with shadow and forgotten lives. Lyra pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around Leo, tucking his small head beneath her chin, feeling the fragile pulse beneath soft skin. His breathing was shallow, a tiny, fragile puff of warmth against her neck, a stark, precious contrast to the pervasive chill that clung to everything. The doorway they had claimed for the night, recessed and marginally shielded from the direct assault of the elements, offered little true sanctuary. The biting wind whipped through the narrow passage, carrying with it scraps of discarded paper that skittered like nervous creatures and the distant, mournful wail of a siren, the city's harsh, perpetual lullaby. She shifted on the cold, unforgiving ground, every bone aching, every muscle protesting the ceaseless, grinding demand of survival. This was her life now, a life lived precariously on the edges, a constant, desperate, exhausting search for warmth, for safety, and for the next meager meal that would keep the emptiness at bay for a few more hours. Her gaze, weary but fiercely protective, drifted down to the sleeping baby in her arms. Leo, just 3 months old, and his tiny lungs already knew the harsh kiss of the polluted air, his ears intimately familiar with the jarring rumble of passing traffic and the shouts that sometimes echoed in the night. His tiny face, illuminated faintly by the grudging light of a distant street lamp filtering into the alley, was a study in pure, vulnerable innocence. His brow was smooth, unfurrowed by worry, his lips parted slightly in sleep, a soft, trusting expression that twisted Lyra's heart. And then there were the eyes. Even closed, nestled beneath delicate lids, she saw them in her mind, the memory sharp and clear, that impossible, piercing shade of blue, the color of a summer sky just after dawn, before the city smog could dull its brilliance. His eyes, Victor's eyes, a cruel, constant, inescapable reminder of the man who had put them here, who had walked away into the light, into a world of power and privilege, leaving them to suffocate in the crushing darkness of poverty. A wave of nausea, a familiar companion fueled by hunger and the acrid taste of despair, twisted in her gut, mingling with the deeper, more corrosive pangs of pure, unadulterated grief and rage. How could a man, the father of this child, look into those eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly, so undeniably, carrying the very blueprint of his being, and simply walk away? He had held Leo in his arms, briefly, in those first confusing, desperate days after the break, his face a mask of polite disinterest, and had shown no flicker of recognition, no spark of connection to the life they had created. He had left her for power. The whispered words of his farewell were a brand on her soul, a searing, unforgivable reminder of his choice. He had chosen the glittering, ruthless ascent to the top, the cold, hard currency of influence and control, the intoxicating allure of absolute power, over the quiet promise of a future with her, over the sacred, miraculous possibility of this child. And the cost of his towering ambition, the price of his dazzling, meteoric rise, had been her complete, brutal annihilation. He hadn't just left. He had deliberately, systematically erased them from his life, as if they were inconvenient data points to be deleted. It felt like a ghost story, a faded, almost unbelievable memory now. The life they'd shared before the ambition consumed him entirely, before the city's allure became an addiction. They'd lived on the fringes of the countryside, a deliberate choice for simplicity and quiet, in a tiny, rambling cottage hidden by ancient woods and rolling hills, a place where the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth after a rain, and the loudest sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant bleating of sheep on a nearby farm. It was simple, isolated, lacking in modern conveniences, but it was theirs a sanctuary built on shared dreams and mutual support. And it was filled, for a time that now felt impossibly distant, with laughter and the intoxicating energy of Victor's boundless dreams. He was a whirlwind then, devastatingly handsome, brilliantly articulate, his mind always churning with grand designs, his ambition a palpable, restless force that seemed to crackle in the very air around him, promising a future that felt limitless. He wasn't born into the world he craved, the world of old money, inherited influence, and entrenched power structures. He was an outsider, hungry, fiercely intelligent, and utterly determined to claw his way to the very top, to reshape it in his own image, to leave an indelible mark. And he had convinced Lyra, utterly and completely, with the passionate intensity that defined him then, that they would conquer it together, side by side, a unit against the world. "We'll build an empire, Lyra," he'd promised, sitting by the firelight, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, casting dancing shadows that seemed to hint at the scale of his vision, his blue eyes blazing with an almost messianic conviction that brooked no doubt. He'd sketched out intricate plans on scrap paper salvaged from his sporadic city trips, diagrams of interconnected networks, soaring financial structures, political alliances forming like constellations. Not just the money, though that will come, mountains of it, more than we could ever spend. An empire of influence, of real, tangible change. We'll bend the city to our will. We'll leave our mark on the world, a mark so deep, so significant, it can never be erased. She had believed him, with the blind, unwavering faith of first love, of complete devotion. She saw the fire in his soul, the restless energy, and was certain it was fueled by their shared future, by the profound, quiet love and trust they built in their secluded world, a bond that felt unbreakable. She was his quiet harbor, the place he returned to recharge, to shed the nascent pressures of his growing world before plunging back into the demanding, cutthroat realm of networking, deal-making, and relentless self-promotion. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, to anticipate his needs, to offer solace when a plan faltered, to celebrate the small, hard-won victories with a genuine joy that mirrored his own, feeling like an essential, hidden part of his success. She was his partner, his confidant, his everything. Or so she was devastatingly, tragically wrong. The change began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a parasitic vine slowly, patiently, but irrevocably strangling the life from a vibrant tree, draining its energy, twisting its form. His trips away from the cottage became longer, stretched into days, then weeks, leaving Lyra alone for extended periods. His phone calls, once filled with intimate details and shared jokes, became shorter, more infrequent, more businesslike, punctuated by the impatient tapping of fingers on a keyboard or the distant murmur of other, important voices. The fire in his eyes, once directed towards their shared horizon, towards the future they would build together, became solely, ruthlessly focused on the distant, glittering towers of the city, symbols of the world he was now fully immersed in, the world that was consuming him whole. He started wearing suits even when he visited, sharp, expensive armor that seemed to shed the comfortable, earthy clothes of their life like a skin he no longer needed, no longer wanted, a past he was eager to discard. His conversations, when they did talk, were filled with names she didn't know, senators, CEOs, media moguls, power brokers, complex financial terms that flew over her head like migrating birds, and political maneuvering that sounded utterly alien, cold, and calculating, a game with rules she didn't understand and stakes she couldn't fathom. She tried desperately to keep up, tried to understand, to bridge the widening gap, to remain relevant, but the chasm between their worlds was expanding day by agonizing day, hour by hour. The first time she saw it, truly saw the depth of the change, the extent of his transformation, was at a rare, lavish public event he insisted she attend. He framed it, as always, as important for their future, a necessary step to introduce her to the periphery of his new world. She felt utterly out of place in her simple, albeit carefully chosen, dress, a vibrant splash of color perhaps, but undeniably naive and unsophisticated amidst the sea of diamonds, designer gowns, bespoke suits, and surgically enhanced faces. She clung to his arm, her grip perhaps a little too tight, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel, a sense of belonging that was utterly false. Then she saw him across the impossibly grand ballroom, beneath the chandeliers that glittered like frozen stars, their light reflecting off polished surfaces and expensive jewelry. Talking to a woman, sleek, sharp, radiating the kind of polished power, effortless grace, and absolute belonging that Alara had only ever read about in magazines discarded on train seats or seen in fleeting glimpses on television. Victor was laughing, leaning in conspiratorially, his hand resting casually, intimately on the woman's arm, his expression one of utter absorption, admiration, a profound, instantaneous connection that spoke volumes. It was the look he used to reserve only for her, the one that had made her feel like the center of his universe, the only woman in the world, but amplified, sharper, colder, honed for this new, important audience, this new alliance. He looked happier, more alive, more truly himself in that moment than he had in months during his visits to the cottage. And he didn't even see her, standing just feet away, clinging to his public facade. A part of his required accessories for the evening, she was a ghost in the room, utterly invisible to the man who was, still, against all evidence, her entire world. That night, back in the cold, quiet reality of the cottage, the contrast between the glittering ballroom and their simple life stark and painful, she confronted him, her voice trembling, not with anger. Anger would come later, a bitter, enduring, life-sustaining flame, but with a raw, aching fear that clawed at her throat and tightened her chest. "Victor," she'd whispered, reaching out a hand that felt impossibly heavy, reaching for a connection that was already severed. "What's happening to us? To you? We feel miles apart, like strangers living in the same house." He sighed, a weary, impatient sound that chilled her far more effectively than the damp night air outside. It was the sound of a man whose time was being wasted. "Lyra, I'm entering a new phase. This is necessary. You have no idea what it takes to get to the top, the constant pressure, the compromises required, the connections I have to make, the image I have to project." His voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. But his eyes, those beautiful, cold blue eyes, finished it for him with devastating clarity. "You are a compromise. You are a connection that no longer serves my purpose. You do not fit the image I need to project. You're excess baggage." The final break wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no thrown objects, none of the dramatic displays of anger or heartbreak you read about in novels. It was devastating in its quiet, clinical, chilling cruelty. A few weeks after the disastrous event, she had told him about the baby, her voice small, filled with a tentative, fragile hope, daring, against all evidence, to imagine his joy, their planning for a future, their future, a new life that might bridge the growing gap between them. She envisioned him sweeping her into his arms, his ambition momentarily forgotten in the face of this miracle, this undeniable link between them. His reaction was a chilling, absolute absence of feeling, a vast vacuum where warmth, joy, even surprise should have been. He sat across from her in the small cottage living room, the familiar scent of wood smoke in the air, the fire crackling obliviously in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on a face that was a mask of cold, clinical calculation, devoid of any humanity she recognized. A baby. His voice was low, flat, utterly devoid of any recognizable emotion. No surprise, no joy, no fear, just a profound, unacceptable inconvenience. "Lyra, that's impossible, utterly impossible. Now, at this crucial, most delicate stage of my career, it cannot happen." Her hope, fragile as a spiderweb spun in the morning mist, crumbled into dust. "Impossible? But it's our baby, Victor. Yours and mine. A part of us." He leaned forward, his eyes fixing her with an intense, unnerving stare that made her skin crawl, made her feel like an obstacle, a problem to be solved. There was a hardness in them she had never seen before, a ruthless determination that chilled her to the bone. "My rise is imminent, Lyra. Everything I've worked for, sacrificed for, clawed for, is within reach. This is the final push, the moment of truth. A child. A child is a complication I cannot afford. Not now. Not ever. Not in the world I'm building. It doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the image. She stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time, seeing the monstrous, towering selfishness lurking beneath the charm, the brilliance, the ambition. You don't want him? Your own child? A piece of you? Wanting isn't the point, he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the last vestiges of her naive hope, severing the final tie. He doesn't fit the narrative I'm crafting. He's a liability, a link to a past I must shed completely to move forward, a past that has no place in my future. And, he added, rising to his feet, the expensive fabric of his suit rustling, a sound like dry leaves skittering across cold stone, a sound of finality, of dismissal. Neither do you any longer. You are part of the past. You are the loose end. He stood up then, a figure already belonging entirely to another world, a stranger in their shared home, a ghost of the man she had loved. He walked to the door, the threshold between their past and his glittering, powerful future. He paused for just a moment, his hand on the knob, a brief hesitation that felt less like regret or second thought and more like a final check, a confirmation of his decision, a calculation. I'm leaving, Lyra. Everything here, this life, it's in the past. It's gone. You need to understand that. Clearly. Do not try to follow. Do not try to contact me. Consider this a severance. And then he was gone. The quiet click of the latch echoing in the sudden, vast, crushing silence he left behind, a silence that screamed of abandonment and finality. The shock was absolute, a physical blow that stole her breath, left her numb, her mind struggling to comprehend. She stood there for a long time, the world tilting sickeningly on its axis, the simple, beloved cottage transformed into a tomb of broken promises, a monument to a love that had been casually discarded. She didn't cry then. The pain was too deep for immediate tears. They came later, a torrent of grief, betrayal, so profound it felt like a physical wound tearing her apart, and a crushing, terrifying loneliness that settled deep in her bones, a coldness that no fire could ever truly dispel. Her descent into homelessness was swift, brutal, and she soon suspected with a cold certainty that chilled her more than the winter air, deliberately orchestrated. Victor didn't just leave. He used his burgeoning influence, the networks he had built, the power he was accumulating to ensure she could not follow, could not remain a complication, a potential threat to his carefully constructed narrative. The cottage wasn't hers. The landlord, a man with subtle but undeniable ties to the city's power structures Victor was courting, suddenly became aggressively insistent on outstanding, questionable fees and immediate eviction. Backed by veiled legal threats, she had no means to fight. It was clear someone powerful was pulling strings from a distance, efficiently erasing her presence from the countryside, pushing her towards the anonymity of the city. Her attempts to find work, even the most menial jobs in the nearby town, were met with polite but firm rejections, doors closing inexplicably in her face. It was as if a silent, invisible wall had been built around her, a systemic exclusion designed to push her out of sight, out of mind, out of existence entirely. She burned through the tiny amount of savings she had, selling the precious few belongings she owned piece by piece. Furniture, sentimental items, anything to buy time, to buy food, to have a roof over her head for just one more night. With no family to turn to for help, no support system left after being so isolated with Victor, and a rapidly growing belly that was both a miracle and a terrifying, visible vulnerability, the cold, anonymous streets of the near city became the only place left for her to go, to disappear. Now, wrapped in the cold, hard reality of the alley floor, the memory of his departure, his words, his eyes, was a sharp shard lodged deep in her heart, a constant, throbbing ache that never dulled. He was living a life of unimaginable power and privilege, lauded and admired, his name in the papers, his face on television, while she was fighting for scraps, begging for shelter, shielding his son from the rain and cold in forgotten doorways. and underpasses. The sheer, unadulterated injustice of it burned hotter and more fiercely than the most persistent cold, a fire that kept her alive. Leo stirred again in her arms, whimpering softly, his tiny body shivering despite her efforts to keep him warm. Lyra gently rocked him, murmuring reassurances she barely felt herself, her voice a low, broken prayer against his soft hair. He needed her. He was innocent in all of this, a tiny, blameless life brought into a world that his own father had actively made hostile, a world that wanted to erase him. Looking at his face, at those impossibly blue eyes that were so much like Victor's, a new, hard feeling began to stir beneath the layers of despair, fear, and crushing pain. It wasn't just sorrow anymore. It was a hardening, a fierce, unyielding resolve forged in the crucible of abandonment and hardship. Those eyes weren't just a painful reminder of what she had lost, of the man who had betrayed her. They were a symbol of what he had deliberately, ruthlessly abandoned. A truth, a living, breathing truth that he had tried to erase with cold, efficient calculation. And maybe, just maybe, that truth, embodied in this innocent child, was the one thing she had left that held any power at all in his glittering, gilded, untouchable world. She didn't know how yet. The path was obscured by the city's shadows and her own pervasive despair. The task felt utterly insurmountable, but she wouldn't stay a ghost in the alleys forever. She couldn't. Not for Leo. The cold hadn't broken her spirit. It had tempered her, forged her like steel hammered and shaped in the harshest ice, making her brittle but strong. The constant, gnawing hunger, the perpetual state of bone-deep exhaustion, the ever-present, low-level thrum of fear that was her constant companion. Tightening her muscles, sharpening her senses, they had stripped away everything extraneous, everything soft, everything she thought she was, leaving only the raw, vital core of her being. A mother's fierce, protective, almost savage love for her child, a primal instinct to defend her offspring against all threats, and a woman's burning, undeniable need for accountability, for justice in a world that had delivered only cruelty and injustice. Her days ceased being solely about the desperate scramble for the next meal or the next safe corner to curl into for a few hours' sleep. They became about observation, learning, planning, a new purpose, cold and sharp, but intensely focused, began to take root in the barren landscape of her life. From the periphery of the city's gleaming, inaccessible heart, she watched. She haunted the edges of the financial district, the parks where power brokers in expensive coats took calculated strolls beneath manicured trees, their conversations discreet and low. She watched the lobbies of towering glass and steel buildings that smelled of marble, money, and abstract, unattainable power, guarded by impassive security. Dressed in layers of ill-fitting, discarded clothes, scavenged from bins and charity drops, stained and worn, she blended into the background. Just another one of the city's many invisible inhabitants, a part of the urban landscape people saw, but didn't truly register, like pigeons or potholes. But her eyes, weary from lack of sleep, but now sharp and alert, missed nothing. She watched the sleek black cars glide by like silent predators, their windows tinted, the people emerging from them radiating an air of effortless importance, their briefcases like shields, their faces masks of focused ambition, already belonging to their destination. She looked for him, for Victor Vance. She learned the rhythm of that world, a counterpoint to the chaotic, unpredictable beat of the streets. The rigid precision of the morning rush, the carefully curated midday lunch crowds at exclusive, hidden restaurants with velvet ropes and intimidating doormen. The late-night departures from offices still ablaze with light, monuments to ceaseless work and ambition, standing sentinel against the night sky. She picked up discarded newspapers and magazines from bins or cafe tables, scanning the business and society pages with an intensity that belied her outward appearance, devouring any mention of his name. His name appeared frequently, his face, sharper now, more severe, cold and unsmiling in the photographs, staring out from glossy pages, the image of success. Articles detailed his latest triumphs, massive mergers, strategic acquisitions, political maneuvering that shifted the city's landscape, reshaping industries. They spoke of his strategic brilliance, his ruthless efficiency, his almost impossibly rapid, unprecedented climb to become one of the city's most influential and feared figures. Each glowing word, each photograph of him shaking hands with politicians or smiling beside other powerful people was a twist of a knife in Lyra's gut, a stark, agonizing contrast to the reality of her life, a life he had personally authored with a few cold words and a closed door. The power he had gained wasn't abstract, a concept debated in universities. It had a name, a face, and a tangible, physical presence woven into the very architecture and economy of the city, controlling flows of money and information. He was building his empire, just as he'd promised, grand and seemingly unshakable. But the foundation, she knew with a bitter, absolute certainty, was built on lies, broken promises, and discarded lives. Her life, Leo's life. Gathering information was a slow, painstaking, and profoundly dangerous process. She learned to listen, not just to individual words, but to the tone, the context, the unspoken meanings and snippets of conversations overheard on park benches, drifting from open-air cafes as she huddled nearby, or emanating from car windows paused at traffic lights. She learned to read body language, to sense tension, to identify who held power, who was desperate, who was vulnerable, and who merely served the powerful without question. Sometimes, amidst the discarded coffee cups and wrappers, she would find crumpled documents, discarded reports, even crumpled invitations to exclusive events, tantalizing, infuriating glimpses into a world so far removed from hers it felt like another dimension entirely, another planet orbiting a different sun. These scraps of information were like breadcrumbs in a vast, dark, hostile forest, tiny, fragile pieces that, when painstakingly put together over time, slowly began to form a clearer picture of Victor's world, its hierarchies, its vulnerabilities, its predictable routines, the cracks in the facade. Leo was her constant shadow, strapped to her chest or back in a makeshift carrier fashioned from layers of blankets and a sturdy scarf, secured with knots she checked a dozen times a day, trusting them with his precious life. His weight was a constant, wearying strain on her body, an ache in her shoulders and back, but his presence was also her anchor, her shield in a hostile world, and her most profound motivation, the living embodiment of her purpose. People were less likely to be overtly hostile, less likely to see her as just a nuisance or a threat, less likely to report her when they saw the baby. But his eyes, those startling, luminous blue eyes, were a constant source of agonizing, terrifying anxiety. As he grew, as his small features became more defined, the resemblance to Victor became more pronounced, less a fleeting echo and more an undeniable, startling, dangerous mirror. He was now 6 months old, his small body becoming more active, his babbling a sweet, innocent, dangerous sound in quiet spaces, his gaze sharp and intelligent, taking in the world around him with wide-eyed wonder. She lived in perpetual fear that someone, anyone, who knew Victor Vance well might look into Leo's eyes and make the connection, a connection that could expose them, a connection that Victor's cleaners were actively seeking to erase. There were close calls that stole her breath, moments where the thin, fragile veil of her invisibility seemed to tear, where the two worlds, hers and his, brushed against each other with terrifying, dangerous proximity. One crisp autumn afternoon, lurking near the polished granite entrance of a major financial building Victor frequented, she saw a well-dressed woman pause near the entrance, her phone call ending abruptly, her eyes drifting idly over the small crowd of passers-by and loiterers. Her gaze fell on Leo, nestled against Lyra's chest, bundled against the cold. Lyra's body tensed for immediate flight, her hand tightening instinctively around her son, preparing to vanish. The woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, her perfect, composed smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She stared at Leo for a beat too long, a beat that felt like an eternity. Then her gaze flicked up to Lyra's face, a brief, intense look of something Lyra couldn't decipher. Pity? Recognition? A shared understanding of loss? A flicker of the past? Before she smiled again, a brief, sad smile, and said softly, her voice low, filled with an unexpected, fleeting sorrow that resonated with Lyra's own pain. He has beautiful eyes. Just like. She trailed off, her smile fading completely, a distant, melancholic look entering her own eyes, lost in a memory that clearly caused her pain, a wound that hadn't healed, before she turned abruptly and hurried inside the building, disappearing into the polished, controlled interior. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, trying desperately to escape its cage. Just like who? Had she recognized Victor's eyes in his son's face? Or just the striking color, sparking a memory of someone else? Perhaps someone else Victor had stepped on or left behind in his ruthless ascent, another casualty of his ambition? The uncertainty was terrifying, leaving her trembling long after the woman had disappeared, the encounter a chilling reminder of how close she was to being seen, how fragile her disguise, how many ghosts Victor might have left in his wake. Another time, trying desperately to find warmth and a few moments of precarious respite in a crowded train station waiting area, the air thick with a mingled sense of coffee, hurried commuters, and stale despair. A security guard with hard, suspicious eyes eyed her and Leo with open, unwelcome suspicion. He was a bulky man, radiating an aura of low-level authority and latent threat, and his gaze lingered on them for too long, his hand resting pointedly on the radio clipped to his belt, his posture signaling a challenge, a demand for identification she didn't have, a prelude to being questioned, detained, potentially discovered, potentially flagged. Lyra didn't hesitate for a second. She melted away, using the flow of commuters rushing to catch their trains as cover, weaving through the crowd with a practiced, desperate urgency, her heart pounding a frantic, fearful rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't afford to be noticed, questioned, identified, run through any system that might flag her as a loose end from Victor Vance's past, a problem to be dealt with. Her hard-won invisibility was her only safety net, and it felt thinner than ever, stretched taut over an abyss of unimaginable danger. But the risks, the fear, the relentless, terrifying close calls, they didn't deter her. They honed her, sharpened her resolve, stripped away any lingering hesitation or doubt, any faint hope that things might resolve themselves. Each challenge overcome, each tiny piece of information gathered, each terrifying near miss, fueled the cold fire within her, transforming her irrevocably from a passive victim, huddled in the shadows, into a calculating, determined combatant. She wasn't just surviving anymore, clinging to the edges of existence, hoping to remain unseen. She was on a mission, a quest for something more profound, more necessary than daily bread and shelter. Her plan was still nebulous in its precise execution, the how-to a daunting, constantly shifting puzzle built from scraps of information, guesswork, and desperate hope, a structure rising from the urban decay. But the why was crystal clear, etched in the deep lines of her weary face, the haunted look in her eyes, and the unwavering depth of her love for her child. Victor needed to face the consequence of his ambition, the human cost of his ruthless, relentless rise. He needed to see the life he had callously destroyed, the woman he had discarded, embodied in the innocent eyes of the son he had abandoned as easily as he would discard a broken tool, a failed prototype, a losing stock. She began to focus her observations with a predator's precision, not just watching, but analyzing, looking for patterns, for weaknesses. Victor's patterns weren't just routines. They were habits, potential vulnerabilities, points of potential leverage. Where he went, when, with whom. She noticed from discarded schedules, overheard snippets of conversation outside his office, and mentions in business columns that he often had a late-night, somewhat less formal meeting at a specific, discreet, highly rated restaurant downtown on Thursday evenings. She saw the same sleek black car, the same impassive driver behind the wheel, a silent guardian, a fixture of his powerful routine. A routine. Routines, in the world of power and security, were both a sign of absolute, almost arrogant control and a potential exploitable vulnerability, a predictable path that could be intersected. Routines created opportunities. The city lights, once a cold, mocking, unattainable display of a world she was utterly excluded from, a painful reminder of a life she had lost, now seemed to illuminate a path, however faint and perilous, cutting through the oppressive darkness of her existence. A dangerous path, fraught with unseen obstacles, hidden traps, and the constant, suffocating threat of exposure and permanent erasure. A path that mirrored Victor's own ruthless ascent, but from the opposite direction, from the bottom up, fueled by desperation instead of ambition. She was no longer just the passive victim of his swift, brutal ascent. She was becoming a force, small and operating in the deepest shadows, but moving with a quiet, inexorable momentum towards the glittering summit where he resided, the place where the threads of his power converged. The cold of the streets was still her reality, the hunger a constant ache, the exhaustion a physical weight that never lifted, but the fire in her heart was growing, burning steadily, a silent, fierce promise whispered to the child sleeping against her, oblivious to the dangers they faced, the battle they were fighting. They were coming from the shadows to demand what was owed, what had been stolen, what had been abandoned. Her target solidified, the discreet, upscale restaurant downtown on Thursdays. It was called the Gilded Cage. She'd learned from a discarded business journal, a name that resonated with a bitter, poetic irony. Apartment, a cage built from wealth and power, trapping those who believed they were free, who lived behind bars of their own making, oblivious to the lives crushed beneath their ascent. It wasn't his impenetrable office tower, a fortress of biometric scanners, armed guards, and layers of corporate security that felt utterly insurmountable, but a place where he might be slightly more relaxed, slightly less guarded, where the perfect facade might be momentarily lowered over expensive food and wine, a chink in the armor. Getting inside was still likely impossible for someone like her, a ghost of the streets, stained by desperation and hardship, but perhaps getting close enough, making a statement, forcing him to see them, truly see them. That was the goal now. It wasn't about rejoining his world, a world she now saw clearly for its glittering emptiness, its inherent cruelty, and its suffocating control. It was about disrupting it, leaving a mark as indelible, as painful, as the one he had left on her life, a mark that couldn't be wiped away by wealth or influence, a truth he couldn't escape. Planning for a Thursday operation at the Gilded Cage required weeks of meticulous observation, planning, and preparation, all undertaken amidst the relentless, grinding, life-consuming reality of her daily survival. She studied the restaurant's routine from afar, learning when deliveries arrived, when staff took their breaks, the layout of the street, the location of service entrances, identifying potential blind spots from the street-level security cameras she painstakingly tried to locate amidst the urban clutter and facades. She needed to be there in the late evening, the coldest time, when Victor would likely be present, when Leo would hopefully be asleep, but still terrifyingly vulnerable. She needed to look less like a homeless woman, less like a threat, more like someone who might, however fleetingly, awkwardly, belong on the fringes of this upscale neighborhood, someone who wouldn't immediately trigger alarms or draw unwanted attention from private security or observant passersby. Scrounging better clothing became a desperate priority. A cleaner, darker coat that didn't have obvious tears or stains, trousers that weren't ripped, sturdy, unbroken shoes that allowed her to move quickly if needed. It was all pieced together from clothing donation bins in more affluent areas and the slightly less sorted corners of dumpsters behind expensive boutiques. A grim, humiliating, necessary parody of getting ready for a night out, a flimsy, ill-fitting mask she had to wear to pass through the city's invisible social and economic barriers, to become, for a moment, something. She was not. The chosen Thursday arrived, a day as gray and biting as all the others, the sky a vast, indifferent sheet stretched taut over the city, promising only cold, and more hardship. Alara spent the daylight hours finding a relatively safe, sheltered spot a few blocks from the target area, conserving her energy, trying to build a small reservoir of physical and emotional strength she knew she would desperately need for the coming ordeal. She fed Leo the best she could, rationing their meager supplies, ensuring he was warm and as comfortable as possible, his familiar weight a heavy comfort and a crushing responsibility. As dusk settled over the city, painting the towers in bruised hues of purple and gray, illuminating the windows of the Gilded Cage, she began her approach towards the restaurant. The transformation wrought by the scavenged clothes was minimal, superficial, but significant enough to alter how people perceived her, if only for a fleeting moment. She still carried the subtle, pervasive scent of the street, the deep-seated weariness in her bones, the sharp wariness in her eyes, but the slightly better, cleaner clothes gave her a sliver of camouflage, a temporary, precarious pass into a different zone of the city's social hierarchy. Leo was bundled tight against her chest, his small body a fragile, warm weight, hopefully quiet, his face mostly hidden against her shoulder, his very innocence a stark, poignant contrast to the dangerous world they were entering. The restaurant area was a stark, almost disorienting contrast to the alleys, abandoned buildings, and underpasses that were her usual domain. Warm, inviting golden light spilled from the large windows of the Gilded Cage and neighboring establishments, pools of light on the clean pavement, illuminating potted trees and brass railings. The air here smelled not of damp concrete, decay, and exhaust fumes, but of expensive food, fine wine, and subtle, elegant perfumes that spoke of a world of effortless leisure and unattainable luxury. The sounds were muted, a low hum of hushed laughter, the gentle clinking of glasses and silverware, the soft murmur of polite conversation, and the low rumble of powerful engines idling at the valet stand. Valets in crisp, tailored uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, opening doors for impeccably dressed patrons who emerged radiating an air of effortless belonging, their steps confident on the clean pavement, their faces composed masks of privilege. Lyra felt the familiar, unwelcome prickle of the old shame, the feeling of being an outsider, a ghost, amplified tenfold in this environment of exclusive luxury and casual wealth, like a stain on a pristine carpet. But the cold, burning resolve, the memory of Victor's indifferent eyes, his ruthless words, the knowledge that he might be hunting them, it kept it in check, hardening her will, focusing her purpose. This wasn't about her shame anymore. It was about his consequence. She found a vantage point across the street, tucked into the deep shadow of a large decorative planter box outside a closed boutique. It offered a relatively unobstructed view of the restaurant's entrance and the stretch of street where cars pulled up to the valet. The cold was intense here, amplified by the wind whistling down the avenue, cutting through her layers despite the better clothing. It was a physical pain that surpassed the dull ache of hunger, a constant, teeth-gritting agony that tested her limits, reminding her of the price of her mission. Finn stirred in her arms, a soft whimper of discomfort escaping his lips, and she immediately nursed him, shielding them both further with her body and the shawl, murmuring soothing, meaningless nonsense against his soft hair, her heart aching for his innocence in this brutal world. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, those startling, brilliant blue orbs, blinking slowly as they adjusted to the unfamiliar, bright lights across the street, the glittering reflection of a world he belonged to but had never known, a world his father had chosen over him. Lyra held his gaze, a silent, desperate, heartfelt conversation passing between them across the chasm of his infancy and her pain, his innocence a stark, unbearable counterpoint to the darkness of their mission. This is him, little one. This is his world. This is what he chose over us. Remember, for this we fight. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into an eternity. The cold became unbearable, a physical agony that tested the limits of her endurance, a pain that surpassed even the constant ache of hunger and exhaustion. Her limbs felt numb, her fingers stiff, her core temperature dropping despite her efforts. Doubt, insidious and cold as the wind, began to creep in her mind, a chilling whisper that threatened to extinguish the fire in her gut entirely, to make her turn back. What was she doing? Was this madness? Risking Leo's safety, keeping him out in this brutal, freezing cold, drawing near to a predator for what? Revenge? Recognition? A futile attempt to prick the conscience of a man who clearly had none? Would Victor even care if he saw them? He had discarded them so easily, so completely, as if they were nothing more than inconvenient objects, statistical anomalies, errors to be corrected. He had erased them from his life. Perhaps they were equally erased from his memory, his heart, his conscience. The weight of the world, of his power, felt crushing, insurmountable. Then, just as despair threatened to consume her entirely, to drown her in its cold depths, to force her to retreat, defeated and broken, into the familiar anonymity of the alleys, to give up the fight and just try to survive for Leo, Finn stirred in her arms again. He wasn't whimpering this time. He was awake, his small body shifting, his head lifting, looking up at her face, his small hand reaching out through the confines of the carrier to touch her tear-streaked cheek, his tiny fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a gesture of pure, simple, unconditional love and trust that pierced through her despair like a ray of light, grounding her. And his eyes, those deep, incredible blue eyes, so uncannily like his father's in color and shape, those eyes that had been the initial cruel reminder of her pain, were filled not with sorrow or coldness, but with a warmth and innocence Victor's now utterly lacked. They were wide and fixed on her face with a simple, trusting, unwavering gaze. They held a clear, luminous, unwavering light in the harsh, indifferent darkness of the alley, a light that seemed to reflect the distant glow of the gilded cage, but purify it, redeem it, holding a promise of something better, something earned. In that moment, looking into those eyes, the eyes of the child she had fought so hard, suffered so much to protect, the child who was her entire reason for enduring, for breathing, for fighting, Elara felt the embers within her ignite again, not into a raging, all-consuming fire of vengeance, but into a steady, focused, determined flame, tempered by the ice of her despair and strengthened by the profound, unwavering depth of her love for Finn. This wasn't just about hurting Victor, or even about getting an apology or recognition for herself, for the woman he had loved and discarded. It was about her son. It was about ensuring that this innocent life, this pure, blameless product of a love he had so callously discarded, would not remain a shadow, invisible and forgotten by the world, least of all by his own father. He might have erased her, severed her ties to her past life, systematically pushed her out of sight, made her a ghost, but he couldn't erase Finn. Not if she fought. Not if she used the truth of his existence, the undeniable proof etched in his face and captured in the photograph, as her weapon, as her claim. The despair receded, pushed back by a wave of cold, clear resolve that settled deep in her bones, a new kind of strength hardening her weary body, replacing the ache with purpose. Seeing him, seeing his world up close, had been a shock, a painful, brutal confirmation of her loss, and his terrifying transformation into something cold and distant, seemingly invincible. But it had also been a crucial, necessary lesson. She couldn't confront him head-on, not yet. He was too well-guarded, too powerful, too detached, too dangerous, too untouchable in his tower of power. She needed a different approach, more subtle, more strategic, more impactful. Her plan wasn't about breaking into his gilded cage with brute force or desperate pleas. It was about finding a way, however indirect, however difficult, however risky, to force him to look out, to break through the walls he had built around himself, to acknowledge, to see the truth he had buried, the life he had destroyed, the son he had abandoned. And she would use the one thing that undeniably linked them, the one thing he had tried desperately to pretend didn't exist, his son, with his eyes, and the proof of their shared past she had found, the photograph. The cold still bit, a constant physical reminder of her harsh reality, But Lyra felt a different kind of strength settling deep within her, a quiet resilience born of fire and ice, of pain and purpose, of desperation and love. She had come to the edge of his world tonight and hadn't been seen, not truly seen as a threat or a ghost from the past. That was fine. For now, she would continue to watch, to learn, to gather more than just observations. She would find the weakness in his fortress of power, the chink in his armor, the secret he guarded most fiercely, the person he couldn't afford to disappoint, the deal he couldn't afford to lose, the reputation he couldn't afford to tarnish. She had nothing left to lose but her son's future, his safety, his right to exist. And that meant she had everything, absolutely everything, to fight for. With a ferocity she hadn't known a human being could possess, a ferocity only motherhood and ultimate betrayal could forge. She turned away from the warm, inviting glow of the gilded cage, melting back into the city's anonymous, unforgiving shadows, not defeated, but regrouping, her resolve hardened, her purpose clear, carrying the most potent, dangerous weapon she possessed, the undeniable truth of his past, looking out at the world he thought he controlled absolutely, in the face of a child he had tried to forget. The fight wasn't over. It had just escalated. The decision solidified. The Atherton merger was the key. That was his vulnerability, the event that would make him risk everything to maintain his spotless image, the culmination of his ambition. The merger deadline, which Arthur, her contact, had confirmed was fast approaching, was her timeline. She needed to use her leverage before that door slammed shut, sealing his victory and their fate. Arthur, the old journalist whose life had also been chewed up and spat out by the city's powerful, listened patiently in his dusty corner filled with old newspapers and the ghosts of stories past. He recognized the fire in Lyra's eyes, the quiet desperation, the dangerous glint of resolve. He saw the potential in her, the raw force of a mother wronged. He became her unlikely mentor, his cynicism a shield, his fragments of knowledge a map. He examined the photograph with rheumy eyes, recognizing the paper type, the style common years ago. Authentic, he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Proof undeniable. But proof is only useful if it gets to the right eyes. And you can't just hand this to any reporter, child. Most are owned, one way or another, by men like Vance. They'll bury it. He confirmed the rumors about Victor's growing paranoia regarding his past, the loose end from the countryside. He knows you're out there, Arthur said, pushing a cup of lukewarm, weak tea towards her, or enough to have dogs watching. Your face, the boy's eyes, they're marked. You're not invisible anymore, not to his people. Your attempt at the cage, it stirred the pot. He warned her again about Victor. Ruthless, came out of nowhere, clawed his way up, stepped on anyone who got in his way, professionally, personally. They say he has eyes everywhere. Cleaners, the kind you don't walk away from if they find you. The knowledge that she was actively hunted added a terrifying, constant layer of tension to their existence. The streets weren't just indifferent now. They were potentially treacherous, full of unseen eyes, potential traps. Every discarded piece of trash, every idling van, every stranger who lingered too long, every shared glance. They could be his agents, watching, waiting. She and Leo had to become even more adept at disappearing, finding deeper shadows, constantly moving, never staying in one place too long. Arthur helped where he could, sharing meager supplies, providing snippets of information gleaned from his network of street contacts and old media pals who fed him scraps of gossip about the city's elite, the scandals simmering beneath the surface. He confirmed the absolute criticality of the Atherton merger to Victor's power, the intense pressure to keep everything quiet, to maintain the perfect image until the deal was sealed. The danger was real, palpable, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. One afternoon, hiding in a bustling market crowd, blending into the flow of shoppers, Lyra saw a man fitting a description Arthur had given her. Sharp suit but slightly worn at the cuffs, eyes that scanned the crowd with unnatural focus, a controlled, almost military way of moving. A cleaner. He was subtly, systematically scanning the faces in the crowd, his gaze lingering on women with babies. Lyra pulled Leo's carrier closer, turning away, melting back into the throng, her heart pounding, the photograph a heavy, terrifying weight in her inner pocket. They were getting closer. Too close. Her plan had to evolve again. Getting the photo or Leo directly to just any journalist at a public event was too risky now, too likely to end in them being permanently handled before the truth got out, the leverage silenced. She needed a safer, more strategic way to deliver the leverage, or to find someone powerful enough, and perhaps equally threatened by Victor Vance's unchecked power, to act on her behalf. Arthur suggested focusing on Victor's rivals, or people within his own organization who might feel threatened by his absolute power and ruthless disregard for loyalty. Power creates enemies, Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. And ambitious men like Vance step on throats to climb, even the throats of those below them, those who help them rise. There's always someone waiting for the king to stumble, waiting for the right push. She began to observe Victor's company headquarters, not just the public front, but the side entrances, the loading docks, the nearby coffee shops where employees took breaks, the bars they frequented after work. She looked for signs of discontent, for individuals who seemed less confident, more stressed, or who exchanged furtive glances when Victor's name came up. It was a shot in the dark, painstaking work based on intuition and desperation, looking for a crack in the facade of his empire. Days blurred into weeks, then months, marked by the rising cold of winter and Leo's growth. Finn was nearing his first birthday. He was crawling now, pulling himself up on anything stable, his curiosity boundless, a small explorer in a dangerous world. His babbling was turning into recognizable sounds, attempts at words, mama, duh, though never directed at anyone but her, sounds of curiosity and frustration. He laughed easily, a pure, bright sound that was like music to Lyra, a painful reminder of the simple joys Victor had forfeited for power. Caring for him became exponentially harder as he grew more mobile, more vocal. Hiding a mobile, sometimes loud baby in alleyways, doorways, and forgotten corners was a constant, nerve-wracking challenge that stole her sleep and frayed her nerves. The guilt of the life she was forcing him to live, the dangers he faced every waking and sleeping moment, was a heavy, crushing burden, sometimes heavier than the fear of being caught. Was this quest for justice, for acknowledgement, for a future where Leo wasn't erased, worth the price Finn was paying in hardship and constant peril? She looked into his eyes, saw the trusting love there, the bright innocence, and knew she had to see it through. Not just for justice for herself, but for his future, a future where he wasn't a hidden shame, a dangerous secret, a loose end to be handled. One rainy evening, sheltering in the doorway of a closed bookshop near Victor's building, the air smelling of damp paper and cold stone, Lyra saw a woman emerge from a side employee entrance, looking utterly defeated, a stark figure against the backdrop of the city's lights. She was well-dressed in professional attire, but her shoulders sagged, her face was etched with stress lines and the fresh tracks of tears, and she clutched a box of personal belongings, a clear sign of dismissal. She sat on a wet bench nearby, tears streaming down her face, making no attempt to hail a cab, lost in her despair. Lyra's instincts screamed danger. Interacting with anyone directly connected to Victor was incredibly risky, potentially a trap. But something in the woman's raw despair, her visible, public defeat, resonated with Lyra's own pain. This was someone else who had been used and discarded by the man who valued power above all else. Hesitantly, driven by a sudden impulse, a faint hope of finding a fellow casualty, Lyra approached her, shielding Leo from the rain with her shawl. Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft and used to speaking to strangers from this world, and used to offering comfort she herself so desperately lacked. The woman looked up, startled, her eyes widening at the sight of Lyra, the worn clothes, the bundled baby, the wariness in her gaze. "Oh," she began, her voice thick with tears. "I'm sorry," Lyra said quickly, holding up her hands slightly to show she wasn't a threat. I saw you were upset. It's raining. She gestured vaguely with her head towards the building. Are you from there? The woman hesitated, looking at Lyra, then the building, then back at Lyra, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Then a bitter, choked laugh escaped her, a sound of pure pain. From the building? Not anymore. Just fired. After 10 years. Loyal service. Working late nights, weekends. Giving them everything. Her voice cracked, fresh tears streaming down her face. Because I questioned one little detail about the Atherton merger. Something that didn't quite add up. She looked at Lyra, her eyes hard with sudden anger. He called me a liability. Said I didn't fit the future he was building. Threw me out like trash. Lyra froze, her heart pounding. The Atherton merger. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor Vance. The woman spat the name out like poison, the embodiment of her sudden ruin. The man building his empire. On the backs of people like me. Like everyone he uses and throws away when they're no longer convenient or they know too much. Lyra's heart pounded harder, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. A discarded piece from his own machine, fresh and raw with betrayal. He discards people easily, Lyra said, her voice low, revealing a shared, painful understanding that spanned worlds. Especially people from before. From the countryside. The woman's eyes narrowed, suddenly sharp, piercing through Lyra's disguise. She looked at the baby, then back at Lyra. You know him? From before? From the countryside. Lyra nodded slowly, a dangerous gamble, but one she felt compelled to take. She pulled Leo slightly forward so his face was visible in the dim light, bundled against the cold, but his eyes open now, wide and curious, those impossible blue eyes. Yes, she said, her voice quiet but firm, a statement of undeniable truth. From before. The woman stared at Leo, at his eyes, then back at Lyra's face, putting the pieces together. The worn clothes, the baby, the shared history, the ruthless man who erased inconvenient truths. A dawning, shocked comprehension spread across her features, wiping away the tears momentarily, leaving her face pale. The rumors, the whispers about a loose end, the man's notorious lack of sentimentality, his hidden past, it all clicked into place. Oh God, she whispered, covering her mouth with a trembling hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and understanding. He really did. And he's been looking, trying to make you disappear. Permanently, Lyra finished for her, the word flat, devoid of emotion, heavy with meaning. The woman, whose name she learned was Sophie, was terrified by the reality of Victor's ruthlessness and the danger Lyra represented, but her own raw pain and sense of injustice, her fury at being so casually discarded after years of loyalty, outweighed her immediate fear. She had been loyal, competent, a trusted employee, and Victor had crushed her, destroyed her career, ruined her life, simply because she asked one too many questions, saw one too many things. Lyra showed her the photograph, the picture of them at the cottage, her pregnant belly, the word future in Victor's hand on the back. Sophie stared at it, her face pale in the dim light, trembling. This changes everything. The merger, if this got out, the Athertons are very particular about the reputations of their partners. And the media, they'd have a field day. It would prove he built his empire on lies, on destroying lives. Sophie didn't necessarily want revenge in the same visceral way Lyra did. She wanted justice for herself, exposure for the man who had wronged her, a chance to reclaim some dignity. Lyra offrait la proposition à dangereuse alliance. Lyra had the proof, the undeniable, living link to Victor's hidden past, embodied in the photo and in Leo, the son with his eyes. Sophie had the knowledge of how Victor's world worked from the inside, the contacts within the lower ranks, the understanding of the system, perhaps even knowledge of his schedule and movements beyond the public eye, things Lyra could never access from the streets. They could help each other. They could be each other's leverage. It was a dangerous, desperate alliance, built on shared pain, mutual need, and a burning desire to see Victor Vance face consequences. Sophie was risking everything: her safety, her reputation, her future prospects, by associating with Lyra, the very loose end Victor wanted contained, silenced, made to disappear. But her burning resentment, her sense of betrayal, fueled her courage. She provided Lyra with crucial details, low-level login credentials to a company news portal that might contain schedules, information about internal couriers, a confirmed route Victor took during his daily commute that had a brief, exploitable pause near a public park, names of journalists who were genuinely independent and known for tackling corporate corruption, not easily bought. The plan evolved into something more sophisticated, more targeted, leveraging Sophie's insider knowledge and Lyra's hard-won street skills of observation, timing, and invisibility. The goal was no longer just a desperate cry for attention, but to deliver the photo and Leo's story to the right person, a reputable investigative journalist who wouldn't bury the story, at a time and place that maximized impact and minimized the risk of immediate interception by Victor's increasingly active cleaners. The Atherton merger signing event was still the ideal date, the point of maximum pressure on Victor, maximum media attention, maximum vulnerability. The risk was immense, escalating daily. Victor's hunters were still searching, their presence a constant, chilling awareness. Lyra saw signs of their presence more frequently now. A car she recognized parked subtly on a street corner she often passed. A man in a fedora, sitting too long in a park she frequented, asking quiet questions. She became a phantom, moving through the city's underbelly, using abandoned tunnels, service routes, the chaos of transport hubs, always aware, always watchful, always ready to vanish at a moment's notice. Finn, now walking with wobbly, determined steps, made it harder to remain hidden, but his growing awareness also meant she could communicate with him, teach him simple, vital things: when to be quiet, when to stay hidden, when to follow her instructions without question. His eyes, those blue eyes so like his father's, held a knowingness beyond his years that both broke her heart and filled her with fierce pride. The day of the Atherton merger signing arrived, a day heavy with anticipation and dread. Lyra's nerves were frayed, stretched thin by months of constant fear, hunger, cold, and a looming, terrifying culmination of her plan. She had the photo, carefully wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, to protect it. Sophie had relayed the final details: the specific entrance for the press, the estimated time Victor would arrive, the name and description of the target journalist, a seasoned reporter known for his integrity. Lyra, dressed in her best scavenged disguise, layered for warmth, Finn clean and bundled tight against the chill morning air, felt a cold, unsettling calm settle over her. This was it, the culmination of everything: the pain, the loss, the fight, the hope. The hotel was a fortress of glass and steel, swarming with security personnel in crisp uniforms and throngs of media, their cameras and microphones creating a buzzing, electric atmosphere. The air was thick with the tension of a high-stakes deal, the culmination of months, years, of ambition and maneuvering. Limousines idled, disgorging important-looking people in expensive clothes. Lyra, with Leo bundled against her, a small, seemingly harmless figure, was a tiny anomaly in this world of power and privilege, a ghost walking amongst the living. She felt the familiar prickle of invisibility, the weight of being unseen, but this time she was using it deliberately, a cloak she wore. She moved through the edges of the small crowd gathered outside the designated press entrance, mingling with curious passers-by and less important attendees, pretending to be a curious onlooker. Her eyes scanned the faces, looking for her target, the journalist with his distinct features and press pass, the man Sophie had described as trustworthy. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but she barely felt it, her body numb, her focus absolute. Then she saw him, Victor, emerging from a sleek black car, flanked by his inner circle, a confident, triumphant smile on his face, illuminated by camera flashes. He looked every inch the powerful man the papers described, the king in his element. He was shaking hands, posing for quick photos, acknowledging the cheers of shareholders, the undisputed center of his universe. Her breath hitched. This was it, the moment, the terrifying, long-awaited moment. She needed to get closer, needed to catch the journalist's eye, needed to break through the cordon of security and publicists. The photo felt like a lead weight in her pocket, her only weapon. Leo, sensing her tension, stirred against her, his small head lifting, his wide blue eyes taking in the bright, chaotic scene, the lights, the cameras, the crowd, the glittering, inaccessible entrance. Lyra took a step forward, then another, pushing past a large, enthusiastic man, trying to get closer to the velvet ropes leading into the hotel. Security guards were directing the flow, their faces impassive, barriers of muscle and uniform. She spotted the journalist she recognized from Sophie's description, talking animatedly into a microphone, his attention momentarily focused on a politician arriving. This was her chance. It might be the only one. Gathering every ounce of her strength, every shred of courage honed by months of hardship, she pushed forward slightly, trying to make herself seen, to break through the periphery, to call out above the din, "Excuse me. Please, Mr. Davies, I have something important. About Victor Vance." Her voice was hoarse from disuse, thin, barely a whisper against the city noise, the media chatter, the rumble of traffic. A security guard near the rope line immediately noticed her, his expression shifting from benign crowd control to polite but firm dismissal. "Ma'am, you need to step back. This area is restricted. Please move along." He began to approach, a polite barrier moving into place. Panic flared, sharp and cold, threatening to overwhelm her. She was going to be shut down before she even got the chance, before the right person could see, before the truth could get out. In that split second, driven by a desperate, primal instinct, knowing this was her last, best chance, Lyra pulled Leo slightly away from her chest, adjusting his carrier, just enough for his face to be clearly visible, his brilliant blue eyes wide and curious, looking directly towards the entrance, towards the cameras, towards the chaos of the world his father inhabited, reflecting the glare of the media lights like twin beacons. Simultaneously, the journalist she had targeted, Mr. Davies, turned slightly, his attention drawn by the commotion, his professional instincts on high alert for anything unusual. His eyes, scanning the crowd, landed on Lyra. And then, undeniably, they landed on Leo. For a fraction of a second, a beat that felt like an eternity, the journalist professional, composed mask faltered. His eyes widened dramatically, flicking from Leo's face back towards the hotel entrance where Victor Vance was still basking in the attention, surrounded by his people. Then back to Leo again, a frantic, internal processing clearly happening. A look of shock, of sudden, jarring recognition, of intense journalistic interest flashed across his face. The resemblance was too striking, too undeniable, too potent. Those eyes, and the whispers he might have heard about a loose end, a hidden past Victor wanted buried. It all coalesced in that instant. Lyra met the journalist's gaze across the heads of the crowd, her own eyes pleading, desperate, but filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. She quickly fumbled in her pocket, pulling out the plastic-wrapped photo, holding it up for him to see, thrusting it forward like a lifeline. It was hard to make out clearly from a distance amidst the flashes and the crowd, but the shape, the faces, her Victor, her pregnant belly, the implied context, the dates scribbled on the back. It was enough. The journalist's eyes fixed on the photo, then back at Leo's face, then swung wildly towards the entrance where Victor, still smiling, was now shaking hands with the Athens CEO, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering on the periphery. The security guard reached Lyra, his hand extending to gently but firmly guide her back, his voice polite but insistent. "Ma'am, I must insist you step back. This area is restricted. Please move along now." His eyes, Lyra cried out, her voice finding a raw, powerful strength born of desperation. cutting through the din, louder this time, try to reach the journalist, trying to reach anyone who would listen, who would see. He left us. For power. He abandoned his son. Look at his eyes. He's Victor Vance's son. The journalist, sensing a story exploding right in front of him, a scandal that could rock the city's power structure, made a quick, decisive decision. He signaled urgently, frantically, to his cameraman, pointing toward Alara and Leo, then back towards the hotel entrance where Victor Vance was still holding court. He took a step towards Lyra, pushing past the edge of the crowd, his microphone held out, his face alight with a reporter's hunger. Before he could reach her, before the microphone could capture her words clearly, another figure moved swiftly, silently, and with terrifying purpose. Not a security guard, but a large, nondescript man in a dark coat, emerging from the edge of the valet stand, a part of the background that suddenly became the foreground threat. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, his eyes cold, fixed solely on Lyra and Leo. This wasn't about crowd control or public relations. This was the permanent solution Arthur had warned her about. Victor Vance's cleaners, the men who made problems disappear. Fear, cold and paralyzing, seized Lyra, gripping her heart in an icy vice. She had made too much noise, drawn too much attention. She had risked everything, stepped out of the shadows, and now they were in immediate, dire, possibly fatal peril. The journalist was still approaching, microphone extended, shouting questions. The dark-coated man was closing in, his hand beginning to disappear inside his coat, his intention unmistakable. Lyra had seconds. Instinct took over, honed by months of street survival. She turned, pulling Leo tight against her, burying his face in her shoulder, shielding him from the sight, shielding him from the coming danger. She plunged back into the anonymity of the wider street crowd, pushing, weaving, forcing her way through the startled bodies, disappearing as quickly as she had emerged. The journalist's shouts of "Wait! Please wait!" Your story, faded behind her, mixed with the sudden, sharp, guttural command from the dark-coated man's direction, aimed at his own people. She didn't know if the journalist had gotten a clear look, if his cameraman had captured anything useful, if he had understood the magnitude of the claim. She didn't know if the photo, briefly glimpsed, was enough on its own. All she knew was the immediate, desperate, overwhelming need to escape, to protect Leo from the danger her desperate act had unleashed. She ran, merging with the indifferent, flowing river of city life on the sidewalk. Her heart pounding, Leo clutched tight, his small body a warm, precious weight against her, his powerful blue eyes hidden against her shoulder once more, a secret kept safe for now. She had forced him to look, perhaps, forced his world to see. But at what cost? The fight wasn't over. It had just become infinitely, terrifyingly more dangerous. The streets, once a place of passive, grinding survival, were now a battlefield. She was hunted. The anonymity that had been her shield, her only defense, was compromised, perhaps irrevocably. Every shadow felt like a hiding place for Victor's people. Every car that slowed seemed like a potential threat. Every stranger who met her gaze for too long sent a jolt of fear through her. Arthur's warnings echoed in her mind, permanently handled. She couldn't go back to her old haunts, couldn't risk leading the hunters to Arthur or any other tenuous connection she had made. She had to disappear completely, find new ways to be invisible, deeper, safer places to hide in the city's vast underbelly. The cold and hunger were still her enemies, constant and relentless, but now they were joined by a very human, very powerful, very dangerous predator, relentless in his pursuit of a clean narrative. But she had done it. She had thrown a stone into the placid, carefully controlled waters of Victor Vance's world, just as it reached its peak. She had shown them Leo. She had shown them the photo. The seed of doubt, of scandal, was planted. Whether it would grow, whether it would force him to finally acknowledge his son, to face consequences, or simply lead to their destruction, she didn't know. Days later, hidden in a forgotten corner of the city's vast, labyrinthine underground network of tunnels and abandoned spaces, a place where the city's roar was a distant echo, she heard the whispers filtering down, brought by others who lived in the depths. News of a disruption at the Atherton merger signing. Rumors of a disturbance involving a woman and a child. Veiled references in the official news to unforeseen complications causing a delay in the final signing. A rare stumble for Victor Vance. Arthur found her, his old face grim, carrying a small package of food. "They're everywhere," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Looking. Harder now. Official channels, unofficial. You shook the tree, child. Caused a tremor. The merger is delayed." He's furious. But the king isn't fallen. Not yet. And they know who they're looking for now. He confirmed Sophie had been apprehended by Victor's security shortly after Alaire's escape. Her fate was unknown, a chilling reminder of the cost of their brief alliance. Lyra looked at Leo, now awake, playing quietly with a discarded bottle cap in the dim, damp light of the tunnel, his blue eyes wide, trusting, innocently unaware of the forces arrayed against him. The fight had cost them dearly. It had cost Sophie her freedom, potentially her life. It had made Lyra and Leo targets in a deadly, relentless hunt. But they had survived the initial blow. And the truth, however fragmented, however dangerous, was out there. It had touched the surface. Holding Leo close, feeling his small heart beat against hers, the most precious thing in her world, Lyra knew the fight wasn't over. It had simply entered a new, more dangerous, more desperate phase. She had forced him to look, forced his world to briefly glimpse the life he had discarded. The gilded cage might still stand, its occupants still powerful, but she had found a way to rattle its bars, to sow a seed of chaos. The path ahead was terrifying, uncertain, and fraught with peril unimaginable from the safety of the streets. But she would walk it. She would fight. For Leo. For justice. For the truth that lay undeniably, beautifully, dangerously in his eyes. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories like this.